We had survived a traumatic birth and had clung to life, determinedly fighting off the economic challenges of our early years. As a precocious youth, we had snapped at the hand that bled us, had fought our master of 700 years in a new kind of war, economic war. Our people had suffered want and hunger as we were shut out of the British market on which we had heavily relied. And, against all the odds, the Irish David had withstood the might of Goliath. We had won. The annuities of £100 million, which our former master had demanded from the young Irish state, and which were at the root of the economic war, were now reduced to just 10 millions. Britain had returned to us the naval ports which they had retained in Ireland, and we now again had access to their marketplace. The year was 1938, and with that painful period behind us, we now looked forward to the rewards, as Britain was now again profitably open to the exports of our biggest industry, agriculture. But that prize was to be knocked from our grasp as Herr Hitler strutted across Europe and plunged it into war. Newspapers were snapped up as people awaited word of their fate. Were we to be dragged into yet another chapter of horror so soon after World War I? We were to read of a momentous and united political decision, with Eamon de Valera forging agreement with all political parties that we would remain neutral. The decision was greeted with confoundment, dismay, and anger by our friends in Britain and America. We were seen by some as ignobly denying our duty to humanity, vindictively looking on and not lifting a finger to help as the dogs of war tore at the body of our nearest neighbour, the ancient enemy Britain. To others, we had remained aloof in the moral company of such states as Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain. We wore our neutrality not with particular pride, but we embraced it with welcome relief. We, at least, were to be spared the man-made hell of war. While our neighbours suffered that maelstrom, we were engaged in a relative inconvenience, not a war, but an emergency. Neutrality meant we might have to defend ourselves against both sides, the Allies or the German Axis. So 250,000 men were recruited into various defence forces. There was the People's Army of the LDF, the local defence force. There was the LSF, local security force, which helped the Gardaí contain the internal threat of the IRA, which was sympathetic to the Germans. There was, of course, the regular army with their reservists, in their German army-style helmets, the so-called coal scuttle helmets, which were changed later in the war. It was uncertain which side posed the greater invasion threat. The country was put on full alert on one occasion, believing that the British army was to swarm over the border and take the country. Later it was feared that the Germans would first overrun Britain and not stop there. By deploying our tiny and ill-equipped army and the LDF, we would at best have delayed the march of a determined invader. The LDF had 100,000 men with no guns, as helpless as civilians, it was said. Another 20,000 men had guns with only 100 rounds of ammunition each. Our army never exceeded 2 divisions and 2 brigades, and the Germans had deployed 136 divisions in invading Holland and Belgium. But in their ranks were united as never before the men who only a short time previously had been divided by a civil war. Now they were bonded by the common cause of defending our sovereignty. And that common cause dispelled the old bitterness, which one writer said would sullenly and silently flare in some quarters at the sight of a national army uniform before the war. And while the state was neutral, the tradition of family ties and history, or simply individual decision, saw some 50,000 Irish men take the boat to Britain to join the army there and face the fascists. Irish men who, coming home on leave, would struggle out of their British uniforms and into civic clothes at Holyhead before boarding the boat for their neutral homeland. On the main street of the capital, crude, temporary monuments to the times emerged amid the statues to Nelson, O'Connell, and Parnell, air raid shelters. They were dotted around the city and would give limited protection to 30,000 people at the time, it was claimed, though the responsible government department showed little faith and didn't bother building shelters for their own staff in the Customs House. In that atmosphere of vulnerability, the government decided to introduce an evacuation scheme for children and pregnant mothers in the Dublin and nearby Dunleary areas. Plans were drawn up for the mass evacuation to rural areas as far away as County Leitrim, should Dublin be attacked. The children were to be loaded into double-deck buses, so special maps had to be drawn up, giving routes which avoided low bridges, and orders went out to keep those roads clear of overhanging trees, just in case. All things being relative, children from Britain were at the same time arriving to the comparative safety of Dublin from Britain, if their parents could afford it. It was a time of planning for the worst, and meantime making the best of what we had. De Valera's vision of a people living simply with a frugal sufficiency was now to come to pass with a vengeance. Anything which had been imported was now in short supply. Britain had been our transshipment centre of goods from around the world, and now the British not unnaturally took the resentful view that neutral Ireland, shirking the fight and living in comfort as they saw it, should hardly profit from the sacrifices made by the men of their merchant marine in trying to keep their own people fed. Supplies were severely cut back. At first it was hoped we'd cave in and abandon neutrality. Later the British kept us supplied with just enough to keep our economy ticking over on a minimum basis, to keep us out of German hands at least. The brave little industries which had been set up behind the not universally admired tariff walls of a few years previously were now to play an invaluable role in keeping national body and soul together. But they had to struggle, since they were not now being fed with raw materials which had previously been delivered from Britain. Spare parts were devised in their own workshops to keep machinery running. And the building industry, boosted by Fianna Fáil's decision to spend to get housing and industry going, was also hit for lack of cement or timber, or for want of as tiny an item as nails. And anyway, the price of anything imported was climbing. Part of the answer was to set up our own merchant fleet with the establishment of Irish shipping. 15 ships in all, and a motleyed collection they were, bought or chartered anywhere in the world they could be found, and given Irish names like the Irish Oak, Irish Plane, Irish Pine. A gallant enterprise striving to keep us fed, a service to which many Irish sailors gave their lives, 136 in all, with ships like the Irish Pine sunk by a U-boat in the Atlantic with the loss of all hands. And that situation in turn drew on the heroism of the lifeboat service, demonstrated once again in the rescue of the crew of the steam trawler Nogi, which went ashore in strong winds at Inishmore. A sister trawler which went to her aid also ended up in trouble, and it was the men of the Galway Bay lifeboat, the William Evans, which braved the storm and with seas crashing over them saved all 12 crewmen. They were decorated for their gallantry. Ships and the sea were crucial to us as the national mind concentrated on the fundamentals of survival: clothing, shelter, heat, and food. And most of the ships we could get our hands on were put to work finding and bringing home the basic food of wheat. And since bread was now crucial, farmers were forced to put some of their land under the plough for tillage, to produce wheat for bread and oats for horsepower. That was policed by one of the bogeymen of the war period, the hated tillage inspector, who would come knocking on your door to ensure you were working to the new rules in a move which doubled the acreage under tillage. We could only be certain of what we could grow ourselves, and so the providers of food, our farmers, came into their own. They'd been living on slim pickings since the economic war with Britain. They looked back to the halcyon days of the First World War, when they had grown fat by feeding the British war machine. Now there was another war machine to be fed, and so our farmers enjoyed the good times again. They had an assured market for their beef and butter, their cheese, eggs, and so on, and with increased demand came increased prices, even if not as good as those in the golden days of the 1418 war, because now the British had set up price controls and had organized state purchasing boards, so there was no prospect of hungry demand driving prices up further. There was a problem on the farm too. Our beef and milk comes of our grass, and it has to be fed with fertilizer, as do our grain and other crops. But now imports of fertilizer dropped, and we had no nitrogen-producing factories of our own. The fertility of the land went down. It produced less and less. However, farmers were now better off than before, and they were also spared the worst of the privations about which city people or their politicians could do little. A family on the mixed farm of the time would have hens and their eggs, milk and meat, potatoes and other vegetables grown in the garden. And there was hardly a small holding without its sow and her offspring, pink piglets which would soon be foraging in the fields as they grew to become hairy bacon and smoky hams.